Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Classics of Philosophy. I'm your host, Gabriel Turner, and as always, if you go on to enjoy the show and want to give your support, visit patron.podbean.com/classics of philosophy, or alternatively, visit our landing page at theclassicsofphilosophy.podbean.com. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Last episode of the podcast, we discussed imagination, the speculative thinking faculty, and the practical thinking faculty. In this episode, we're going to cover the remainder of the treatise, concluding our discussion of nous, mind, and discussing the other distinguishing feature of the soul, movement. In Chapter 5, Aristotle aims to discuss the mind as being receptive of the form of its objects. If you remember from our discussion of Chapter 4, this receptibility of the intelligible form is similar to the receptibility of the sensible form in the sense organ. Now, this receiving of the intelligible form is what Aristotle claims that the passive mind does. Mind, in the passive sense, is such because it becomes all things. The form of the mind, then, is a receptibility, to become identical to the form it is exposed to and make judgments upon it. At this point, Aristotle says that just as in nature, where there is matter, i.e., which is potentially all the individuals, there's an additional something else, which is their cause or agent, in that it makes them all. This additional something is an aspect of the mind that makes all things. It is some activity of the mind. What this maker mind makes is not directly understandable, and as a result, has been the point of debate in various philosophical circles. Now he closes the chapter discussing knowledge and the priority of potentiality and actuality. Regarding knowledge, he says that actual knowledge is identical with its object. This further endorsing the taking on of the intelligible form in the passive mind. Of the order of potentiality and actuality, he says that potentiality is prior to actuality in the individual, due to the individual's senses and mind being potentially that of their respective objects. But in general, potentiality is not prior, for there must be something existing in actuality for bodies to be potentialities of. In Chapter 6, Aristotle discusses thought in more detail. He says that indivisible objects of thought occurs among things concerning which there can be no falsehood. For example, thought of Socrates. There can be no true or falsity occurring within that set. Truth or falsity only occurs when a compounding of thought occurs. Where truth and falsehood are possible, there's implied a compounding of thoughts into a fresh unity. If a man calls white not white, he has combined the notion of not and white, resulting in a falsehood. This can be understood as a case of division. Aerosol says that indivisibility can be thought of in two senses, potential and actual. For the mind can think of what is both divisible and indivisible in time. This divisibility of time being potential until thought of individually or as another thought. Now, when the object of thought is not quantitatively but qualitatively indivisible, the mind thinks of it in indivisible time and by an indivisible activity of the soul. Of those things that are indivisible, the mind cognizes them by recognizing them from their contraries. For example, if the mind were to cognize the color black, it must first know its contraries in order to determine that it is black. If nothing has contrary of this kind, then it is self-cognizant. Now, Chapter 7 discusses the operation of practical intellect in more detail. This practical thinking faculty involves the use or activity of knowledge. Aristotle states, as has been said, that knowledge, when actively operating, is identical with its object. Motion of this object to the appropriate sense faculty makes it operate actually from only being potentially active. This motion is imperfect. Sensation, then, is like mere assertion and thinking. When an object is pleasant or unpleasant, the soul pursues or avoids it, thereby making a sort of assertion or negation. This phrase is defining the relationship between thinking and sensation, with thinking relying upon external stimuli of which it can then judge. For the thinking soul, images take the place of direct perceptions, and when it asserts or denies that they are good or bad, it avoids or pursues them. Hence, the soul never thinks without a mental image. Now, this is referring to fantasia and an external stimuli. It is here that Aristotle again details how we distinguish between two unlike things. It does this by defining relations to other objects of thought and sensations, and then comparing them. The thinking faculty thinks the form in mental images. And just as in the sphere of sense, what is to be pursued and avoided is defined for it, so also outside sensation, when it is occupied with mental images, is moved. This point that we use to go through this process is a unity, but in a sense just described, it is a point of connection between multiple senses. It connects these related faculties and uses them to compare. In Chapter 8, Aristotle asserts once more that in a sense the soul is all existing things, as we discussed in Chapter 5. He reiterates this idea of sensible forms and intelligible forms, with the former belonging to the sensitive faculty and the latter to the cognitive faculty. These faculties, then, must be identical either with the objects themselves or with their forms. Aristotle asserts the latter, saying that it would be unreasonable to say that the actual stone resides in the soul. He says that the soul, then, acts like a hand, for the hand is an instrument which employs other instruments. And in the same way, the mind is a form which employs forms, and sense is a form which employs the form of sensible objects. From here, Aristotle says that the objects of thought reside in the sensible forms. What he means by this is that in order to cognize, learn, or understand anything, we must be exposed to external stimuli and the act of perception. We must have some mental picture of which to think about, with these mental pictures being movements produced by fantasia, which in turn rely upon perception. Stepping back from the text, we can understand some of what is being said by discussing thought in a more generalized sense. When we think about something, it is either referential, a resemblance, or by means of convention, as in the case of fictional characters. All of this are done through some causal chain occurring in our mind. Now, which of these is Aristotle endorsing here? The answer is none. When mind is receptive of the intelligible form, it is not referencing something, resembling something, or by means of convention. The mind literally takes on the intelligible form, becoming identical to it. This concept is what is known as direct realism. Chapter 9 marks a change in discussion from mind and opens discussion of movement. Now, the soul is distinguished by two functions: the judging capacity, which is a function of the intellect and of sensation combined, and the capacity for exciting movement in space. At this point, Aristotle says that we have concluded our discussion of mind, and so we must discuss what is in the soul that excites movement. We must answer questions such as whether it is separable from the soul, part of the soul, or in the soul as a whole. The first problem we arrive at is in what sense should we speak of parts of the soul, and how many are there? In this chapter, Aristotle alludes to the correct division of the soul into parts, saying that, in one sense, they seem to be infinite and not confined to those which some thinkers describe as, when they attempt to analyze, as calculative, emotional, and desiderative, or as others have it, rational and irrational. When we consider the distinctions according to which they classify, we shall find other parts exhibiting greater differences than those of which we have already spoken. For instance, the nutritive part, which belongs to both to plants and to all other living creatures, and the sensitive part, which one could easily not assign either to rational or irrational, and also the imaginative part, which appears to be different in essence from them all. Additionally, he mentions the appetitive faculty, as being different from them all in the sense that there is will in the calculative and desire and passion in the irrational part. If the soul is divided into three, appetite will be found in each. From here, Aristotle moves on to our main inquiry. What is it that makes a living creature move in space? He says that the nutritive faculty seems to be responsible for growth and decay. But what about traveling movement, i.e. movement in space? He says that it cannot be the nutritive faculty because that faculty always has some object in view. Besides, plants would be capable of locomotion if this were true. Nor is it the sensitive faculty, for there are many living creatures which have feeling but are stationary. Nor is the calculative faculty, which is called mind, the motive principle, for the speculative mind thinks nothing practical and tells us nothing about what is to be avoided or pursued. But movement is characteristic of one who is either avoiding or pursuing something. Action is promoted by desire in the absence of self-control. There's some other factor which causes action in accordance with knowledge that is not knowledge itself. This other factor that he's alluding to is appetite. Chapter 10 finishes discussion of movement. Aristotle states that these two then, appetite and mind, are clearly capable of causing movement if that one regards imagination as some sort of thinking process. Both of these then, mind and appetite, are productive of movement in space. The mind in question is that which makes calculation with an end in view, the practical mind. Every appetite is directed towards an end, for the thing at which appetite aims is the starting point of the practical mind, and the last step of the practical mind is the beginning of action. So these two, appetite and practical thought, seem reasonably considered as the producers of movement. What he means by this is that the combination of these two, appetite and mind, provide the necessary functions to begin movement. Appetite provides the desire, which is then acted upon if calculated by the practical thinking faculty to be worthy of pursuing. Objects of appetite always produce movement, but this may be either the real or the apparent good. This is because of appetite and imagination's characteristics of sometimes being right and sometimes being wrong. In an overarching sense, there must be only one faculty by means of which movement is produced, appetite. For appetite is required for mind to produce movement and is never seen without it. Appetites can conflict, however. This is in the case of those creatures which have a sense of time and can look towards the future. Appetites can conflict where reason and desire are opposed, because desire only looks to the immediate future. That which causes movement is specifically one, appetite, but the things of which cause movement are numerically many. Movement itself involves three factors: the cause, the means by which it produces movement, and the thing moved, the body. The moving cause is of two kinds. One is unmoved and the other both moves and is moved. The unmoved cause is the practical good, while that which both moves and is moved is appetite. This is because appetite influences movement and is itself a movement. The instrument by which appetite causes movement belongs already to the physical sphere, so it must be considered among the functions common to the body and soul. Aristotle uses the analogy concerning the ball and socket joint to discuss the instrument of movement. This analogy is being used to say that just as in the case of a ball and socket, where a beginning and end coincide, the latter is at rest and the former moving, so too is appetite and mind. Movement begins with appetite and ends with the starting point of the practical mind, with this cognitive faculty remaining still. Speaking generally then, as has been said, insofar as the living creature is capable of appetite, it is also capable of self-movement, but it is not capable of appetite without imagination, due to imagination's intra-reliance on appetite, and also imagination involves either calculation or sensation. This latter all other living creatures share alongside man. Chapter 11 is a short chapter that discusses those stationary creatures whose only sensation is touch. Should they too have a share in imagination and desire? In this chapter, Aristotle says that these creatures only seem to have imagination and desire indeterminately, meaning that they cannot conjure up images or desirable things at will, and are subject to the sensations and corresponding desires of their surroundings. If they were capable of imagination determinately, then they would also be capable of locomotion, which in fact they are not. Chapter 12 of Book 3 consists in a simple summation of the De Anima, and I encourage you to read this section to affirm your understanding of the material. Chapter 13 concludes the remainder of the treatise and provides a summary of the sensation of touch. But one may ask, why would he conclude the treatise with this discussion of touch? It is most likely another summation, but with the key takeaway being that without the sense of touch, no other sense would exist. In other words, touch is fundamental to all animal life. Now, why is understanding Aristotle's psychology important, other than for its own sake? This conception of Aristotle's psychology and understanding of the human soul is vitally important in understanding the basis for his account of morality and ethics. If you're encouraged to read his ethics, it is a good idea to have read the De Anima and have a firm understanding of the material. I want to thank you all for taking time to listen to the podcast, and as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me using the email theclassicsofphilosophy@gmail.com, which can also be found on the homepage at theclassicsofphilosophy.podbean.com. Once again, thank you all for listening and joining my journey inquiring about life, customs, and things good and evil. I'll catch you on the next one.